Good morning, St. Francis de Sales. Today's gospel tells us that Jesus went up a mountain by himself to pray. Usually, when we recall stories from the gospel, we recall Jesus being with people, oftentimes surrounded by others. It isn't as frequent that we recall times in which Jesus is alone, or perhaps even seeking such time for himself. We might wonder, what's Jesus thinking about up on that mountain? What is his prayer? For what or for whom is he praying? Earlier on in this same chapter, chapter 14 of Matthew's Gospel, John the Baptist has been killed, murdered, in fact, by political misgivings. This must have been a significant turning point in the story for the evangelist Matthew's community as they originally heard it. Who would dare kill John the Baptist, the one who prepares the way of the Lord? Even so, just a few chapters before, Jesus makes remark. Matthew chapter 11, verses 11 through 15. Amen, I say to you, among those born of women, there has been none greater than John the Baptist. Yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent are taking it by force. All the prophets and the law prophesied up to the time of John, and if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah, the one who is to come. Whoever has ears ought to hear. We might wonder here what Jesus means when he says, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent are taking it by force. I wonder if the kingdom of heaven suffers violence today, right now, in our world. I wonder about how many people have been personally touched and impacted by COVID-19. How many people have lost their lives to it? How many people have survived it? Perhaps, maybe even with their own perspective on their own mortality, changed forever. I wonder how it is that we can treat one another as so utterly other and foreign to ourselves, foreign to our common humanity. I wonder how it is that we, the human community, can treat one another not as we'd like to be treated, but with fearful suspicion, even contempt of what makes us different rather than in celebration of what makes us the same. Indeed, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, even today, right now, in our world. John the Baptist, who Jesus tells us is Elijah, come again, must have known this violence too. Just as Jesus will do after him, Elijah went up a mountain to pray, where, in prayer, he took shelter. Today's first reading from the first book of Kings reminds us that Elijah sought shelter from violence on that mountain, from violence in his world. And even so, he experienced violence all the same. Certainly the wind was violent, strong and heavy, rending the mountains and crushing rocks. Certainly, the earthquake was violent, as the ground beneath his feet sought to unsteady him. Certainly, the fire was violent, kindled by the earth's trembling friction. And yet, we are told that the Lord was not in the violent wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire. Alone on the mountain, Elijah finds not a violent God, but one who speaks peace, the peace of a tiny, whispering sound. Perhaps then Jesus is praying for him, for Elijah, whom he sees in the person of his beloved cousin and friend, John the Baptist, now taken from the world by violence. Amidst what must be an unmoving sadness, Jesus looks out at the world before him, out at the sea on which his disciples flounder. They too are rocked by a stormy violence, by formidable waters which seek to prove themselves. And so, even in unmoving sadness, Jesus moves. He comes down the mountain for which he too sought shelter from the violence in his world, and moves directly towards it. His friends are in trouble, and not even the wrathful waters can stop him. Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid, Jesus tells them. Jesus tells us. Peter's response is an interesting one. Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Instead of inviting Jesus into the boat with him, he asks instead to come out to Jesus on the water. Why? Peter already knows it is not in the boat that he will find peace and shelter from the violence, but in that tiny, whispering sound that says, "Come, come, be with me. Come, let me hold you." We might think that the reason Peter doesn't make it to Jesus before sinking is because Peter doubts Jesus. After all, Jesus does say to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" But the evangelist Matthew does not tell us here that Peter doubts Jesus. Rather, we are told that Peter begins to sink when he sees how strong the wind was. Peter begins to sink at the sight of violence. In this case, the violent storm raging around him. We might consider how often we sink at the sight of violence today in our world, raging all around us. It's overwhelming. But truly, the saddest part of the story is not that Peter begins to sink, but that he was first walking on the water too. I don't know about you, but I've never seen anyone walk on the water. In this story, we see two who do. Jesus, who seeks to calm the fear of his friend, and Peter, who wants in fear nothing more than to be held, than to know peace. When Jesus speaks this peace to him through the tiny, whispering invitation to come, Peter accepts. He gets out of the boat and begins to walk on water. He believes there is peace to be found. He believes this peace wants to be with him too. St. Francis de Sales, we live in a time and a place. We live in a world and in a history of overwhelming violence. There's no doubt about that. But I believe we all doubt, all the same, that peace is to be found. That peace can be found, can be known. And so, we begin to sink. O we of little faith, why do we doubt? Jesus doesn't encourage us to fear for ourselves, nor to fear for our world, but rather, Jesus encourages us to believe in ourselves, to believe in our world, to believe that peace can and will be found when we have courage enough to open our hearts and recognize it in the one who loves us. God blessed be forever. When we recognize it in our neighbor, who may be quite different from us, and yet entirely the same. And when we recognize it, perhaps most of all, in ourselves, who must, if we are to find peace and to know it at all, listen to that ever so tiny whispering sound which invites us to believe, which invites us to know peace, to come and walk on the water.